In 2003, George W. Bush declared war on Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger. On my orders, coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance to undermine Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war.
The conflict had been 13 years in the making, with the initial tensions beginning way back in 1990. Saddam Hussein first worried international peacekeepers when Iraq invaded neighbouring Kuwait. The invasion was ultimately halted by a US-led coalition, but in the midst of the chaos, Hussein strengthened his claim to the power of Iraq. The UN would shortly intervene with Hussein's regime once again, as the ethnic minority Kurds were forced to the north of the country. With increasing reports of brutality, the Allies put troops on the ground to defend the Iraqi Kurds. The UN attempted to punish Iraq with economic sanctions, in an attempt to hinder the nuclear program, which was becoming an increasing cause for concern in the West. Over the next few years, the Hussein regime would continue to ignore the sanctions being put in place, with regular inspections frequently finding prohibited weapons midway through creation. 1998 was the year America finally snapped. Bill Clinton ordered the bombing of several Iraqi military installations, coming under the now infamous title Operation Desert Fox.
This is actual footage from General Cody's mission, the very first Apache strikes of Desert Storm.
When we pulled the trigger, all 4 aircraft shot at the same time. You got 4 to 6 Hellfires en route. The time of flight's about 12 seconds. And then all of a sudden they start hitting. And when they start hitting, things start exploding pretty quickly, especially when we hit where the generators and all the fuel was.
However, as news media picked up on the Iraqi regime and began the scaremongering, Iraq quickly moved on from the bombings, restarting their nuclear program and once again opening trade with neighbouring countries. 2001 would prove to be the major turning point. The 9/11 attacks would shake the Western world. There was now huge pressure on the likes of America to actively tackle terrorism from its so-called home.
This just in, you were looking at obviously a very disturbing live shot there. That is the World Trade Center, and we have unconfirmed reports this morning that a plane has crashed into one of the towers of the World Trade Center. The CNN Center right now is just beginning to work on this story, obviously calling our sources and trying to figure out exactly what happened, but clearly something relatively devastating happening this morning there.
A year later, President George W. Bush concluded that Iraq's support of terrorist organizations such as Al-Qaeda, the perpetrators of the 9/11 attacks, meant disarming Iraq was now the priority. In 2003, Hussein ignored a 48-hour ultimatum to leave the country, and America declared war with Iraq. The media in the US largely backed the war massively. Fox News, which was and still is owned by Rupert Murdoch, were the number one supporters of the war, often presenting their newstime show as Operation Iraqi Freedom.
Stay with Fox 31 for continuing coverage of Operation Iraqi Freedom.
The mainstream media's coverage of the war was controversial right from the start. Broadcaster MSNBC fired a liberal journalist in Phil Donahue in the run-up to the war because of his criticism of George Bush's Iraqi policy. Later, NBC would fire Nick Arnett, another left-leaning journalist, because of an interview he gave in which he stated the United States' first war plan had failed. With tensions building, some outlets were frequently subject to complaints over what was seen to be pro-war propaganda, censorship and biased reporting in general. The Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting group found that both America's most viewed news outlets, Fox and CBS, also happened to be the least likely to present any sort of critical coverage of the war. Despite these complaints, the majority of America was very much behind the war effort, as shown by the University of Maryland's research, which showed that 57% of Americans genuinely believed that Iraq founded Al-Qaeda directly. A further 69% thought Saddam Hussein was personally involved in the 9/11 attacks, and when it came to Fox viewers, 80% of them believed the previous two statements to be true. Even the outlets that criticised the war often had the articles buried deep in the middle of the newspaper, as the Washington Post conceded recently. An article written by the paper's top military reporter in 2002 titled Doubts, which questioned the war, was turned down on the grounds that it relied too heavily on outside experts and retired military officials.
Which brings us to the point of this video. This is Eason Jordan. He worked as a leading journalist for CNN for over 20 years. He was vitally responsible for coordinating the cable's coverage of the Iraq War. He actually left his post in 2005 for an issue unrelated to his Iraqi scandal, this time for suggesting that the US deliberately targeted journalists in a war. The scandal that came to mainstream media attention and ultimately divided the nation came back on April 11, 2003, now known as the CNN Iraqi cover-up. In April 2003, Jordan went to an interview with the New York Times titled, "The News We Kept to Ourselves." In the interview, Eason admitted that CNN had been systematically covering up stories of Iraqi atrocities. Reports of murder, planned assassinations and torture were all suppressed in order to maintain CNN's Baghdad bureau. None of these horrific incidents that CNN claimed to be gathering intelligence for were ever actually reported to the people, with Jordan Eason taking full responsibility. The reasoning behind what Jordan had done is a debate that still divides the members of the public and journalists alike today. Jordan claimed that his decisions were made to protect the lives of those people he met during his 13 visits to Baghdad. He went on to say that this decision meant that the family and friends of anyone involved in the incidents wouldn't get caught up further in the backlash. There were 5 major incidents that CNN decided not to report to the public. Firstly, and most controversially, Saddam Hussein's oldest son Uday confided in Jordan that he wanted to have his 2 brothers-in-law assassinated. Both of whom had defected and were seeking asylum in Jordan. Eason Jordan took it upon himself to warn the King of Jordan. However, the threat was not taken seriously, and just a few months later, both the brothers-in-law were lured to Iraq and were both assassinated. Jordan decided against running the story, as he felt the translator in the meeting would have been killed and tortured. 2 separate cases that emphasise just how brutal Hussein's regime was, and that were also hidden by Jordan, are as follows. Firstly, Uday once again confided in Jordan, explained that the reason an aide had had all his teeth pulled out was because he hadn't been loyal to the boss, and that he was told to never wear dentures to replace them. Secondly, an aide had to write Hussein a letter of congratulations for killing his brother just to prove his loyalty. A recurring theme throughout this scandal was that stories were often not reported to the public as they were deemed to be too horrific. Another horror story that was not reported as it was decided to be too much for the woman's already aggrieved family was the story of a Kuwaiti woman who was murdered for being on the phone to CNN. She was beaten every day, eventually killed and left outside her family home. This was a prime opportunity for CNN to potentially show just how horrific and dangerous it was to live in the regime, but instead they buried the information. The final incident was more of a technical issue. CNN refused to show an interview given to them by the Kurdish forces that appeared to show Iraqi intelligence officers admitting to war crimes. They cited that it would have put their Baghdad colleagues in danger.
There were arguments on both sides of Jordan's moral dilemma. One of Jordan's biggest critics was Franklin Foer, an author and well-respected writer. His view was shared by many, the idea that Jordan would have been better off abandoning the whole Iraq coverage altogether rather than recycling Saddam Hussein's lies. He stated, "And I would argue that the consequences of these compromises that they made far outweighed any sort of journalistic truth they were able to haul out of Baghdad. And in the end, CNN didn't do much more than merely mouth the propaganda that Saddam Hussein wanted to get into Western ears and eyes." The overall feeling from the world of journalism was that Jordan of course violated fundamental and ethical standards of public trust and accuracy, meaning that once a journalist begins to make these sort of compromises, it's a slippery slope towards ethical collision. Then there were more far-fetched criticisms that argued that if Jordan had presented the news more accurately, then maybe the powers that be would have come together and acted more aggressively to stop Hussein's regime more quickly. But people did come out and support Jordan too, with arguments such as some news was better than no news at all from Iraq. And to get this, Jordan had no choice but to make compromises. Furthermore, the US Pentagon would have likely also felt betrayed if Jordan had reported completely accurately on everything he had seen, only putting even more pressure on the US government. Were Jordan's compromises ethically principled and justified, or was he misusing public trust and inadvertently supporting Hussein's regime? What do you think?
In terms of media theory, due to the unique nature of the Jordan Eason scandal, it isn't necessarily easy to apply any sort of traditional media theory. Meaning that because Jordan and CNN chose not to reveal any news to even have the chance to be manipulated, it's difficult to compare. The Eason case does, however, show aspects of the agenda function setting theory. Initially developed by Maxwell McCombs and Donald Shore in 1972, this theory states that corporations have the power to choose where and what the public attention focuses on. And this is done through tricks of the trade, such as pushing more important news and news features further up in newspapers and news outlets. In this case, CNN diverted public attention away from Saddam Hussein's brutal regime, simply by not reporting it. Instead, CNN would focus their views on current issues in the US, such as internal affairs. Though it isn't completely fair to accuse CNN as an entire company of deliberately switching the agenda, the information that was withheld by Jordan and his colleagues meant that they had no say.